and this is your favorite show, Education Exchange, from Public Access TV and Education Channel 21. And it's April, the year 2013, and it's springtime, although we still have a little wind sometime, but today is a beautiful day. And I'm in a very good mood. A little bit nervous, not as you see me all the time, because my guest is a very important person in my life. And the success of getting Pam Ehly here, for me, is a great success. I can always go back, and if they try to fire me or something, I say, I got you Pam Ehly, because she is not the easiest person to have the limelight shed on her. She likes to work quietly, do her job, because she's, to me, the ideal civil servant, the ideal. And I worked with Pam Ehly as a student teacher many years ago. But don't look at me and her now. I was older than her. I just retired from my medical career, and I wanted to be a teacher, and my selection, I selected to be at Lemmy Elementary School because I heard a lot about Pam Ehly. Pam, it's a wonderful occasion to have you tonight.
Well, thank you very much.
And I don't know how to introduce you, but instead of losing the time, I will go to the meat of the show directly, and from there, people who never met you will know who is the person behind all this legacy.
Okay.
And Pam, thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
And I begin by a question of, how did you decide to become an educator?
Well, Hani, as a little girl growing up in Fort Worth, Texas, I had what I thought was a fairly unremarkable childhood, although as I think back to it, and as a survivor of the 1950s polio, and then later as a elementary grade student, I remember some events like the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and living in Fort Worth, that was an important thing because there was a great fear that those missiles would be aimed at the city that had both Bell Helicopter and General Dynamics. And then the year after that, there was the assassination of Kennedy. He'd been in Fort Worth that morning, and many of my friends' parents were at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast, and it was such a shock to hear on the school's public address system that Kennedy had been shot, and then we learned later that he had died. And some of those events, at the time, I really didn't understand the historical impact that they would have. But as a teenager, I had the opportunity to sign up for some volunteer work in the summer, and of course my parents thought that was a great idea. And the volunteer work that I went into was working at a summer camp for children that were disabled, and that really was the beginning of my working with children, and eventually my degree in special education to work with children that had mental and emotional disabilities.
Of course, only you can do this in half a minute. Pam, because there is a lot of misunderstanding, you are the head of the curriculum and instruction in the district, in the Iowa City School District.
That is correct.
Which is a very important and vital position. What it means, Director of Curriculum and Instruction, for the lay people who are not really teachers?
I would tell you that it involves mostly three things. I help the district decide what we teach, how we teach it, and then how do we know if the children have learned it. So what we teach is the curriculum, how we teach it is the instruction, and how do we know if children have learned it is assessment. And over the past 15 years, the amount of...
So what did you leave for other people? All these employees?
Well, they get to do the teaching, yeah, which I do find admirable.
Yes. So those are like three, it's a stool with three legs, as you say. And of course, each one of them, they have this kind of interconnected relationship. And if one of them succeeds, the other may. If one fails, the others may fail too. Now, is there any conflict between this, like when you talk about instruction and then you mentioned the word assessment. Assessment means evaluation. What's the difference between evaluation and assessment?
Well, sometimes when we think of assessment, they may be considered evaluation where you judge, and the assessment piece may be just trying to get a diagnostic read on where a child is, and that information can help you decide what to teach next. So there's both what we call formative as well as summative evaluations.
Let me see. I put down a few questions.
Okay.
And if you want to pass any of them, you have the right to do so. But the first one, actually, you have already addressed, because I needed to know the culture that you were raised in when you were a young kid, and how this has had its impact and influence on the way you thought, the way you decide, and the way you make decisions. But now, because we talked about assessment, let me jump and ask you this question. I wrote here you work with test data for the school district. What is your advice about using and interpreting test data?
My answer to that, Hani, for using and interpreting test data varies depending on who the audience is. If it's the teachers, I'd say primarily you want to look at what the strengths and limitations of an individual child or a whole classroom might be, and then to use that data to help you decide what to teach next. I oftentimes tell teachers there's 3 variables that they really can manipulate: time, method, and materials. If the children know it, you can spend less time. If they don't know it, spend more time. The methods is the way you go about doing it. Do they need it multiple times repeated in the beginning and then kind of distribute that over time for long-term retention? And then, have you got the right materials? Did you select the right textbooks, or did you select the right novels for children to read? And then certainly you need to make some evaluation about how well children have done to modify in the future. If my audience is parents, my advice to them is look at how children have grown over time. Certainly you can look at how they're doing at a single point in time, but especially with tests like the Iowa assessments, you can look at that growth over time. And we know what average growth is, and you want to know if your children are making that average growth, exceeding it, or haven't quite reached that expectation, and then what things can you put into place to assist them. And in general, I would even tell the public not to be overly concerned about any single piece of test data. I do have some general concerns about assessments nationwide and the tremendous value that seems to be placed on them, and that we sometimes overdo.
School of thoughts about this, and some people are really on the other side of the fence saying that's not the way it should be done, and that's very interesting.
So balance would be my key word. We kind of need to balance how we use them and how we interpret them.
I will ask you a couple of really difficult questions to answer. And I don't want to be in your shoes when somebody asks me these questions, but it's in my mind now. If somebody comes from another culture, from another environment, from a different education system altogether, and I put them in front of multiple choice questions with those bubbles and the pencil, and make my decision accordingly, according to their performance on this particular test. Do I really do justice to them? I mean, is it fair? Or shall we tailor our tests according to the cultural differences, educational differences? And you began your conversation with me by mentioning that your base was special education. And I know very well that last year you were honored by a great reward for your work with the gifted and talented part of our population in schools. And so you are dealing with both ends of the spectrum, which is quite a challenge, you know, because we're. So tell me, how do you do that?
Well, I guess I'll go back to that word balance. You have to strike the balance. The reality is that the children that come to our school do have a broad range of abilities as well as talents. And because we are a public school institution, it's our responsibility to teach all children, and the education that they receive needs to be in line with what their abilities are. So whether you're in third grade and you're very talented, or you have some learning disabilities, it really is our responsibility to meet your needs. Sometimes we look at differentiating instruction for students. Now notice I said that we differentiated instruction. I didn't say we differentiated the curriculum, because there are certain things that we think at given ages most children are able to do. But some children may learn it best by listening to it. Others might do better reading, and some might do better with a combination of the two.
Well, thank you for clarifying this, because that was actually a question I kept till the end when I'm going to ask you, is differentiation a discrimination policy? But now you clarified it by saying it's differentiation in the way we teach the same curriculum. Thank you for doing this.
I could give you one quick example. Let's say I were a government teacher and we were looking at monarchy as a type of government. I might ask you to write a paragraph as to what it means. I might ask the next student to write an analogy describing what it is. And I might ask yet a third student, could you give me a list of the key characteristics? So I've differentiated the way I've asked the students to produce their learning, yet we've all learned the same concept.
Or make a piece of art, maybe.
Exactly.
Collage or something, you know, with all the royal families in the world. And yeah, that would be the way we approach it. And this way it makes sense, rather than the general understanding that you really lower the bar for certain people, raise the bar for other people, and then it becomes kind of discrimination. Yeah, definitely. Pam, you are married to one of our scientists in the area of education, a man who had led the way, especially in the area of special needs kids. And Stuart Ehly is a remarkable scientist. I have seen him as a professor in the College of Education. I enjoyed it. I read his papers. With Paul Radish, I think, he wrote a wonderful paper about alternative education before I even joined the alternative education, that made me intrigued by the idea, and because I read Stuart, I went and then joined this service. So tell me now about this kind of harmony between you and Stuart.
You know, I think I'm probably one of the luckiest educators. Because my husband is faculty in the College of Education, he oftentimes has opportunities to read literature and receive advanced notices on research, and he shares them with me. And I feel like I oftentimes get a sneak peek at the next piece of research that educators are going to be reading. And we have our own intellectual discussions about the ivory tower, intellectual, and the practical tower over here, and where do we really see the interface between the two.
And you, of course, your participation, your contribution is the trenches among young kids, because you have your history of legacy of teaching elementary schools, junior high, senior high, and then now the upper administration planners. And he looks at it from the college level and the graduate level. So I believe that kitchen table in your home would be full of data analysis and things like that, you know. That is very interesting. And then Elizabeth came. Tell me about Elizabeth.
Elizabeth is our daughter. She lives in the Chicago area. She, of course, did her K through 12 education here in the Iowa City schools. Had not only the wonderful opportunity to have general education, but she was a musician as well, and had, I think probably one of the shining stars for her was to study with Hani as a clarinetist. She has followed the Ehly trend of staying in education. She works at the University of Chicago and is a research associate there and does data collection for research grants that mostly are related to education. Sometimes it's preschool, early childhood, young teen mothers. She enters her data into stat packages and writes up research reports, and so we're both very proud of her.
I remember many years ago when Elizabeth was a young kid and I did her portrait, and you got me a couple of pictures, and I said, I want to see her personally because I really need to see. And I remember my conversation with her when I was trying to sketch her. And I said, Elizabeth, what would you like to be? And she is, I want to be an educator. And I feel so intrigued by the fact that after all these years and all this time had passed, now we are sitting talking about her doing education career, you know. And that's wonderful that a person would have a dream and then the dream comes true because of hard work. And this will bring us to the next point, which is, how do you foresee, I wouldn't say predict, but how do you foresee the future of our education system? I mean, we read reports about how backward we are, and we are Finland #1, South Korea #2, and probably South Korea is #3. But I don't know. I mean, there are like reports and statistics, and people would say, oh, we are 17, dropped to 23 in math, and what is the story about that? And how can, as an audience, as a reader of a newspaper, how can I say, well, this is an authentic research, I will depend on it. I will go to Pam Ehly and say, our science program is not very good because Finland is doing better. And I see our governor is sending people to Finland to study the system there, and they come to us without knowing anything about that fact that Finland is a different system than us. It's a different culture than us. It's a different belief system than us. Where they want to take the Finland model and implement it. So I am confused, and I'm an educator. How about our friends there that are looking at us now? How can we tell them to find the truth in this ocean of conflicting ideas and philosophies?
Hani, I think one of the biggest challenges is to know whether or not we're really comparing like entities, because certainly if you look at the composite look of what Finland is like and then you look at the United States, those are not the same. Do you know what the poverty rate is of Finland as compared to the United States? They're very, very different. I had an interesting conversation with some of our federal legislators a few years ago when I was attending a conference in Washington, D.C., and the question came up about what was it that we really could do to help children. My response was, if we could help every family have employment to the highest degree possible so that there's stability within the family, a reduction of mobility of the family, health care for children as well as the family, and stability, I think our test scores would increase if test scores is what we're using as a metric to determine what is quality schools. What's very, very difficult for children in terms of learning is moving 4 and 5 times during a school year. And I'm not sure that everyone in our community, much less in the nation, really understands that degree of mobility and the severe impact that it really has on children learning. And that is regardless of whatever level of income that the family is in. But as we know, children that live in poverty move far more often. So just imagine for your own child if every 3 months she picked up and went to a new school, adjusting to the environment, adjusting to the teachers, not always having
peers, friendships,
not having consistency in the instruction. And actually I think that single factor alone would have an enormous impact. And I do think that over time, in the next century, we'll continue to see more diversity in what we teach in schools, just because there are demands placed on us from society. And clearly technology will have an impact, and I do think it'll be a positive impact.
Well, in the area, and I don't want to get into politics at all, but because I have my own ideas in this, and I don't want to get so passionate about one or the other, because I'm a host here, I'm not a speaker. But there are a lot of ideas about charter schools and the privatization of some schools, and in Iowa City here there is a very good model of private school that had been successful with Tim Terry doing the experiment, and it's successful. It is. It looks like they are doing their best because he puts his heart before his money in the project. Do we, as public educators, encourage people like Tim Terry, for instance, to come forward and have their role in education?
Well, it's interesting you asked that in the state of Iowa, because there's been an open enrollment policy in the state for years. Really, families can attend many different school districts in the state of Iowa, as long as there actually is space available in those seats. So the notion of charter schools hasn't been as prolific in Iowa, simply because parents have had choice in the past. And the purpose of charter schools, of course, is to be able to give parents choice.
This will take us to magnet schools.
It could.
Okay. What do you think about magnet school?
The magnet schools that I'm familiar with are in very large cities, so there is the magnitude of the population to be able to draw for the magnet school, the areas of interest. You still need to teach some of the very basics in magnet schools, even at the high school: literature, mathematics, civics, social studies, and the sciences. Where they're most successful, I think, is when you have a large enough population to be able to draw from them.
Most people who really were opposing the idea of magnet schools were taking this position that this is not the best model for our community. Now, there is a question in my mind, because you are the person who sits down and thinks and comes up with the recipe for our curriculum. Now, Pam, I worked close with you as an educator. Later, after I finished my student teacher, I became a teacher. And I worked with you on a committee that's called a middle school committee. And I remember you, days and nights. And we spent a year or so meeting non-stop. And we had subcommittee to do this, and we worked so hard when Dr. Bart Groy and Tim Greaves were the leaders of our system here on this committee. And I had, being part of the committee, really a good feeling about the idea of middle school versus junior high. And a couple of months ago, I had Dr. Schultz from Northwest Junior High, and I told him that I see Northwest is trying to implement a lot of ideas that from the middle school into the junior high. Where do you stand about this? If the community comes up with the idea of middle school and moving the kids, the older kids, the other school away from the elementary school. Would you support that?
You know, Hani, I think we can have elementary, middle school, junior high, all of them can be designed and successful for children. You know, the elements of a middle school are to give children exposure and experiences, lots of exploration. And we've actually had sort of a modified middle school in our junior high schools. The traditional part of the junior high experience is some in-depth studies, though, just like we have in our world languages that you can get both at 7th and 8th. For our community, I don't know if it's an issue of what might be right or wrong as much as it is the community ready for that kind of change? And working with people and building relationships to either maintain what we have or to change what we have is really what's critical to the success or the failure of any kind of a change.
I want to talk to you all night long, but you see Mike Peterson is here giving me the final word. Wrap it up.
All right.
So I don't know, it's difficult for me, but I want you to promise that you will come more
Well,
to
thank you
visit
very
us
much.
here. And to tell you that this program is going to be on Public Access TV on Saturday at 2:30, on Mondays 7 o'clock, and on the Education Channel 21, a lot of times after the board meeting. We may be on the air 5, 6, maybe 10 times. We are on YouTube tomorrow night, so I wish Elizabeth would see it and tell us if we did a good job or not. But we cannot do a good job without the people who are sitting in front of me. John Karhoff, the father of this show, who built it about 20 years ago, or 200 years ago, I don't know. But it has been his brainchild. Mike Peterson by his side all the time. And our audience, I want to thank you very, very much for sharing with me this beautiful evening, beautiful spring evening with our Director of Curriculum and Instruction at the Iowa City Community School District, Pam Ehly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, our audience, and have a very good evening.